Joined today, I'm Sheila Warren. I am the CEO of the Project Liberty Institute, and I'm a week into this role, so it's been quite the initiation this week, and thanks so much to all of you for joining us here today. I'm joined by Meredith Whittaker, Kenneth Cukier, the Economist, Signal Foundation. Need no further introduction. You've probably seen them out and about in many stages over the course of this week. We are here today. We spent a lot of time here at Future House talking about children, talking about online safety, talking about harm, and the realities of all of that. And without in any way minimizing the importance of that conversation, this panel is a little different. We're here to talk about privacy. And specifically, we're here to talk about privacy and speech in our current contemporaneous digital age, which, if we'd done this panel 2 months ago, we'd be having maybe a different conversation, okay? So one thing I wanted to start by teeing up is this idea that we think we have an understanding that illicit activity is bad. And we forget that the word illicit is really what drives the designation that the characterization of certain kinds of activity or certain kinds of content, et cetera. And that definition is a fluid and flexible definition. And we are seeing a moment in time, if I may, where the definition of what is illicit is dramatically shrinking in some places and dramatically expanding in other places. I'll leave it as vague as access to women's health care is now, some of that is now going to be illicit activity and has already been for some time. Certain kinds of communication, certain kinds of language, other things are going to become more or less licit or illicit, which is really a government-defined activity when it comes to retribution against those activities, okay? So our cultural norms of what is okay and not okay differ, in some cases, from government legal norms around those behaviors, and failure to comply with those definitions can lead to very, very real-world life consequences for people. So, given all of that, privacy is a conversation we should be having really everywhere at all times, and we're here to do just that today. So why don't we start by just quickly, why don't you both give me a definition of how you think about privacy? Do you think about it as a spectrum? Do you think about it as binary? Do you think about it as categorical? How do you view differential privacy? And we'll just start with that. Maybe we'll start with you, Meredith, and go to you, Ken.
Yeah, well, I think that's actually a really meaningful question and one that isn't easy to answer succinctly, in part because the definition of privacy that has been whittled away perhaps and kind of concretized over the last 20 or so years with the growth and perhaps metastasis of the current surveillance-based tech industry is a little sterile. It relies on sort of thinking about data flows and where data lives and is it private if it's on your server or my server. And really when I think about privacy, I think about the right to intimacy, the right to love, the right to explore ideas, the right to be with each other in ways that are meaningful, to think about new worlds, to experiment without retribution or shame, and the right not to be classified by others in ways that shape your lives and opportunities and pathways. So that's a much more capacious definition. And at Signal, we try to uphold a version of privacy that is extraordinarily rigorous, in the technical space, that allows for the human right to free expression and communication, and to do that in a world where, it's not just that, how many of you all work for human rights organizations? Okay, I see, a number of you. How many of you are criminalized in one jurisdiction? Okay, everyone, I think, raised their hand, maybe not one person, right? Like, that's what we're talking about, right? And so, it's a right to privacy that on a technological level must be absolute, and it's a right that preserves an ability to express and communicate in a world where we are more surveilled, more classified than we ever have been in human history, and where that surveillance is taking place in large part by a handful of very large corporations that now have sort of the status of, I've called them parastates, kind of companies, kind of governments, and have power over our world in a way that is extraordinarily profound. So I'll leave it there, Sheila, and I want to hear what Ken has to say.
Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, so it's one of those situations where the answer is fantastic, and the question's also fantastic. And let's just take a second and explain why. Often, when you put a superstructure over something, you start talking about the abstraction of that thing, right? These fancy questions and these fancy answers. But you never actually touch the thing itself. You never get to it. So the foundation is really essential. What is privacy? right? We could talk for hours about that and probably advance the conversation by having that conversation. So let's just start just as a foundation and then move on. Okay, so it's the right thing to do. So there is no right to privacy in lots of foundational governmental documents, at least prior to the 20th century. So in the Constitution, there's no right to privacy. The best they could do is create, to imply the right in a Bill of Rights, one of the articles that says that these rights are not the only rights, that you can enumerate other rights in the future. And Justice Louis Brandeis, in a famous Harvard Law Review article about 1890, wrote, maybe it was 1910, but quite early, said, the article is called The Right to Privacy. And he defines for the first time a right to privacy. And at the time, the challenge was the camera, because before then, you'd have the flash of the pan. You had to pose like it was a portrait painting, an oil painting, for the camera. You knew that your image was being taken, and now for the first time with quick photographs, you could that the right to your image was no longer sacrosanct to you. It could be taken by the other people, and there should be this idea of a right to privacy, despite the fact that technology was making the existing law, the right to one's image, moot. That was, say, unenforceable. There would be no, today everyone has a camera in their pocket. There's a zillion cameras when we walk the street, so we have no right to our image. But that, at the time, we had to create that right to privacy. The Supreme Court then defined it as the right to be left alone. The right to be left alone. Think about that for a second. That's not an informational right. It's a physical right. We're defining an informational right as this simulacrum around the right of something of who we are. So there is, in this world of privacy, something called confidentiality. There's also something called intimacy. There's something else that's called personal information, right? But it's a broader issue of dignity and liberty. That is what we're talking about when we say privacy.
Yeah, and so I couldn't have teed this up better for the next question. I think one thing that's important to know about the framing that you laid out, Kenneth, is that the point, I think, the thing that always struck me in law school is that there is no right to privacy defined. And the idea is that it's penumbral. And so the justices in various times throughout the course of the Supreme Court and different hearings that have come down and different rulings have basically said, well, it's there. We can sense that privacy is kind of underlying some of these other rights. Therefore, right, that is the fluffiest, waviest, most unstable definition, as we are seeing in very real time playing out in the United States. Okay, so then, given that we have this definition and we understand that we're always reductive in how we're talking about this, especially when we're putting it into an online space, because privacy is a physical right. It is something that derives from real-world concepts that we all intuitively understand, even if we can't quite craft a definition that's quite concise enough for maybe our liking. And porting that into the online space has its challenges because, of course, every time you do that, you're in a distortionary world and distortionary effect. But second to that is the idea that we talk a lot about differential privacy now, right, in spaces. So you can choose, you want this to be more confidential or more invisible. You want this to be anonymous. You want this thing to be pseudonymous. You want whatever it is. And the idea that you can kind of effectively at scale make those kinds of micro decisions is wild, for one thing. But more than that is we're moving into a world where, as you think about monetization of these models or commercialization, privacy suddenly becomes a privilege. However you define privacy, it becomes a privilege, which I personally feel is deeply, deeply problematic to a degree that it's already the case, okay? I think we should be very honest that a lot of models, the initial way that something was put to scale as a tech product, was put into place or tested on a population that had no recourse, had fewer rights, perhaps, either jurisdictionally or legally or for whatever reason. And then the model was iterated and tested and then adapted for a market where perhaps things were more constrained. And this is just sort of the nature of scale. We all know this. It's how a lot of the platforms we talk about actually started today. So how do we ensure that privacy does not become the refuge of the elite, the bunker, the privacy bunker, right, if you will, and it becomes the default state? Leaving aside the messiness of definitions, which we've landed. Yeah, go ahead.
It's really hard to answer this question from the perspective of sort of this, this real and embodied definition of privacy, sort of, so I want to answer it, because I think that's a political question. Yep. That's not a technical question, and that's a question about how we organize our societies, our economies, our relationships to each other. And then, I don't have time to write 5 dissertations right now. So I want to answer that, zoom it on in from the signal perspective and actually talk about some, the fundamentals of communications network and encryption, right? Encryption either works for everyone or it works for no one. So, you're a very high threat model individual. I'm going to make that up as a caricature of you, but you're going to play that role. And so you have to use Signal because Signal is the gold standard. It's, verifiably private, it's open source, it's tried, it's trusted, it's all of those things. But Signal does not work for you if everyone you love and talk to also doesn't use Signal, right? You need to exchange your public keys, right? Like how public key cryptography works, how Signal works, and how communications networks work. The communication networks becomes more valuable in time with the quantity and quality of the nodes connected to the network. So the network effect for privacy in communications really matters. And it also matters that this is not just siloed to one domain, organization, country, etc. And I'll give a tangible example of why this is so true. How many people here are familiar with the German government Taurus leak? So I follow this stuff, obviously, this is my lane, but basically this was a very embarrassing leak where a number of, very high-ranking German military officials were on a phone call discussing why they would not send Taurus missiles to Ukraine. And this is during a period of brinksmanship between Ukraine and Germany around, the support for Ukraine and the Ukraine war, really heightened conversation, huge political consequences, and it suddenly appears on Russian media, the transcript of the call, the recording of the call. How did this happen? Well, they did have an internal private communication system, some version of WebEx that was encrypted. Only one member of that call got on an insecure Wi-Fi, right? That one weak link compromised the entire conversation. And that's the same with having, privacy just for those in the room. But the second we have to call, our daughter, our dad, that is a leap outside of this private context, and we become the weak link. So there's no signal just for the military. There's no signal just for your organization. Again, it either works for everyone and ensures that level of protection for the most valuable because it works for everyone, or we're talking about vulnerabilities in a system that ultimately cannot guarantee the level of privacy that is necessary to protect the most vulnerable. Anyway.
Yeah. Exactly, right? These are practical realities, right? Because, I think, look, and I'll put it in another context. And we think about, I was at a conversation, we were talking about, cybersecurity is a general matter and threat vectors and all of that. And I'm like, look, brute force attacks are one thing, but let's be really honest. What's happening now is the most sophisticated phishing we've ever seen in our lives, right? And once you have that, you just get someone's credentials. You don't have to spend all of your compute attacking a server. You just literally have a key to the front door. And people are able to now engage in these schemes that wind up being super, 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 super long, months in the making, building trust and all of this kind of stuff, and then getting someone's credentials and attacking an entire network in that fashion. And so this idea of weak links is something that's so hyper relevant to privacy, but it's also relevant in the conversation. We're not having that conversation as often as I believe we should be. But Ken, over to you to add your thoughts.
No, Meredith said it perfectly. I don't think there's anything to add. I guess the only thing that I would say is that there is going to be a cat and mouse game that, let's imagine a world in which everyone is on Signal. Well, suddenly it's not like surveillance goes away. Just now you're looking at endpoint attacks, or you're looking at root key attacks. You're looking at other ways in which, for high-profile targets, you would actually want to access their information. High-profile targets are always going to be targeted. They are a high profile. The problem that we've had in the current communications, but I'll even say the current communications infrastructure writ large, is that it's always been insecure by design because public authorities have always wanted to know information. Yeah. So it might be a surprise to you that every item of mail, the sender and receiver, is photographed and stored. This is well established and in the United States, probably elsewhere as well, but this is kind of well established and well known. It's also pretty much a matter of public record that every single phone call in the United States is recorded and stored for a certain number of days, right? So that if there's when there was the Boston bombing, for example, this is now about a decade ago or so, they were able to go back in time and listen to all of the communication. They could just identify who was making relevant phone calls during that period of time and identify the two kids who were brothers in the Boston area and find them. But that's because they had that data. It's by design. It's also not like this is not known by the government authorities. If you are a member of the House, Committee on Surveillance and Security, you will have top secret access to this information. And of course, some of this dribbles out through open testimony, right? Through the questions that are actually provided to the witness in advance, right? So they know the questions being said. And then when they say, oh, I can't answer that, it was the question that was relevant, not the answer.
I want to tap in on just that point. One of the reasons it's insecure by design is, law enforcement, the state constitutes its power via access to information and information asymmetry, those in power corporations as well, right? That's classic. It's also because of the very particular history of how the commercial internet evolved. And I've done some work on this, but if you look at the 1990s and the legacy of the Clinton administration, when you look at the 1996 framework that laid out the rules of the road for commercializing the internet, which before then was a network for universities and research and military, but that was the golden goose was the internet in the 90s, and it was how do we make this thing go and commercialize it. The rules of the road did two things that I've called the original sins of the commercial internet. One, zero restrictions on surveillance for private actors. So way more permissive in terms of what could be gathered than, for governments. So, there's text in there that's basically like, we know people have warned us about privacy, but we're going to wait and see. If it turns out bad, we'll regulate, but let's let, the free market, in the neoliberal spirit do its thing and see what we do. So they could do anything. And two, and this is really important as sort of a dyad here, endorsing advertising as the business model. And this was heavily pushed by the advertising industry because, of course, they already had TV, print media. They didn't want to lose another platform as a market. So they were like, hey, we also want to be in the internet. So what does that do, right? What does advertising? Know your customer, right? And that sort of incentivized this ad-supported business model that meant that there's actually a huge incentive to gather more and more and more data, to open the floodgates as that no privacy law kind of open season for surveillance, allowed, and create this sort of, platform paradigm where it's not profitable to apply encryption, to apply strong privacy for people. You might apply that for transactions, you might apply that for, authentication, and different business purposes, but there is actually very little incentive to apply that for things like, platforms, communication services, and others, because that's the data that's used to then, create models for ad targeting, to train AI models, et cetera. And that has a lot of explanatory power as to why a handful of, companies that established themselves around that time have more data than has ever been available in human history, and why Signal is a nonprofit. Because we have to ensure that, let's say, a board with a fiduciary duty doesn't push us to prioritize revenue over our obsessive focus on meaningful privacy. And in this moment, in this day and age, because of that legacy, because of the paradigm it created, there is actually no business model that provides the kind of revenue that's expected in tech for meaningfully private communications at the level of Signal.
Yeah, and we can't divorce this conversation from governance. I'm so glad you went there, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the parastate concept you mentioned earlier, and I love that term. We were somehow comfortable. We were very concerned about what the government knew about us, and I think we were trained in the United States in the 60s and 70s. There was enough awareness of the civil rights movement, and sort of the dangers of having government surveillance and government activity in your communications, right? But we were somehow totally okay with corporations doing exactly the same thing and having really, truly unfettered access to our data and information.
So I want to offer some sympathy for the devil, not to defend it, but
Which
simply...
one?
All of them. Yeah, thank you. Good question. Here. But yeah, exactly. For the devils, not to defend it, but to explain it, and maybe just by explaining it, understanding it in its full magnitude. It was how we got here was that information was expensive, and communication services used to be very costly. You would make a phone call. I'm of a certain âge that remembers that if you'd make a phone call, you'd have to pay by the minute. And suddenly, and early email, when email was first initiated, there was a question of should the sender pay or should the receiver pay? And in fact, CompuServe for a period of time had concocted a really interesting model in which both sides would pay. And of course, there was a time that spam was just starting, so people were really upset about it, and you'd have to download it, you're paying for the bandwidth. But the key thing was this, that when companies came into the internet space, they were offering it for free, and that seemed to be a consumer surplus, right? In the same way that early Uber was very inexpensive. And then suddenly, keep in mind, when Gmail came in, it changed the debate. People had to be very cautious in terms of what, if there was an attachment, they sent it through. Gmail offered a gigabyte or something out, some outrageous number at the outset. And they also said, no, don't ever delete your emails. The reason why, if you understand computer science, is you would be otherwise punching a hole in your memory, and it would be costly for them. It was more costly if you deleted an email for them to give you your records rather than just to send you all the records there. And the idea is that you preserve everything forever. Why did they want to do that? Because they wanted to know who the user was. You'd be logged in. You're logged in with Gmail, then all of your searches could attach to you in a stronger way than you could before. So it wasn't ridiculous that they were doing this. Now, of course, they've taken it to an extreme, and now it's the superstructure of the economy, and it creates all these problems.
Is the point, right? And I think
right,
you can
but
look at the
that's how
don't be
we
evil
got there.
origins of this. You can look at the don't be evil Google origins of this, and we're all familiar with the garage and how it started and the whole thing. Subsequent actors, I'm not entirely sure were similarly motivated, but we can put that aside. The point being, at this point, we now have created a system, and we're going to talk about AI, obviously, so get ready for it, friends. We're now in a system where there is an absolute monopoly on some of this data, right, which is held by a handful of actors who have a tremendous amount of information in a super micro-targeted way that initially was about advertising and leveraging some of this, to your fair points, Ken, but now has come to a place where you can't compete without marketplace. Right? And so what does the notion of data rights actually mean in a world where most people of a certain age, which is a quite generationally quite thick set, right? And thicker the further down you go. The younger you are, the more information about you is generated, ironically, right? So how do you think about even the concept of data rights, which don't also exist, by the way, in most places?
I'll start off really quickly. There's an obvious right that can attach that you own your data, but how you get to it requires a hand to John Locke. His view was that he defined modern property in terms of freedom, and the idea was that we own our body, and what we create from our body, therefore, should be a property right owned to us. Yes, I use the timber that God has given me, right? And I've used the knowledge, and I was inspired by my pasture, but because I took the time to do it, actually it wasn't time. He wasn't talking about time, but I took the effort and care to do it with my own hands. What that I created then attached to me as a property right. Our image and our actions and our heartbeats, you could say, well, we didn't have a control over it. Our hemoglobin levels when we're somewhere in the hospital, we don't have a control over it, particularly with our image. But should a data right attach to it? And the answer is quite possibly yes in certain domains, right? When it comes to your image in a public space, that's going to be harder. If they want to monetize it, that actually is not allowed unless you get the rights to it. But in many other dimensions, you could have as a principle either a right that attaches to the data as this sort of shadow or aura around ourselves, or a usage right, that we can actually delegate to other people.
Okay, so let's frame that up in the context of AI then. Like, how are you thinking about that, Meredith, and as a general matter?
Well, let me lob something spicy into the. I mean, we're at Davos. I don't. I'm uncomfortable with the general, like what's generally understood as sort of the right to my data. Like, do I own my data? Is it, like I don't know that I'm comfortable thinking of this as my data. Because, if you look, I a little bit on my background, I come, in a past life, I was building measurement systems, sort of for internet, data, and measurement is basically how data is made, right? You create a methodology around, like, how do I capture some element of the world using different mechanisms that can represent a proxy for a dynamic context, right? And then we have these proxies, they're fungible, we can make conclusions about the world based on the measures we took. And that's a very woolly process. I was measuring like TCP flows and like, RTT time on the like lowest level of the network, right? You'd think that's, like where objectivity lives. And no, if you did throughput, that was a very different number than if you measured goodput, right? And those things were debated hotly in policy rooms because this was going to move billions of dollars of policy making, right? So that was kind of where my epistemics live. And I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of like, data rights would mean my owning my Facebook data, right? The right for Facebook to classify me to begin with using one or another methodology is, for me, what is more problematic there. What does it mean for my life that I'm classified as, this type of person who lives in this type of place, and that shapes my access to a loan, that shapes my access to opportunity, et cetera. And this does leave into, the kind of signal principle, which is we go above and beyond, like developing incredibly innovative solutions to rewrite the stack so we collect and create as close to zero amount of data as possible. Because we don't, if you have the data, it can be breached, it can be misused, it can be used to classify people in ways that harm them or, otherwise, shape their life choices. So I think we need to rethink what data is and denaturalize this idea of data as a kind of organic off gas of ourselves that has just been like captured in a jar by these companies, and realize that a lot of data is just kind of methodologically shoddy answers to questions that help sell ads, and not actually an organic production of who we are. And I think that gets us into conversations around AI, because then we're not just talking about sort of the training data, sort of my telemetry data and data around my shopping habits or whatever it is that then goes into train a model. We're also talking about the inferences that are produced by these models, which may or may not be right, but are sort of the classifications and probabilistic sort of understandings of who we are and what we do that also have power over us. And then this gets us into uncomfortable territory when we're talking about some of this zero knowledge work and some of this on-device AI that is classified as private because the data isn't leaving the device, but the classification is still shaping what we can and cannot access on a device, what we are and are not classified as based on a model we don't have any control over.
So you're making a very useful, I'm going to go right into it. You're making a very useful distinction between the collection of the data and the usage of the data.
Creation of the data.
Correct. So there's the creation, but I'll say the collection, because yes, it's as the touch of a human to say, quantify this, not that, and here's how we're going to do it. So there's an epistemological element to the creation of it, but then once you've decided that, you're now collecting. So, but the point is that you've collected it for one use, and you said advertising, but clearly the problem, and then we have rules that regulate often not the collection but the use of the data. The problem, though, is that axiomatically we've always been in an environment in which we've collected the data for one purpose and we've used it for things that was never imagined when it was collected in the first place, often in the most heinous possible ways. Civic records in the Netherlands in the 1920s and 1930s being used by the Nazis, invading going into the town halls of every town they went to. Okay, so you could imagine that I've got my Apple Watch and I've got my Kindle, two separate things. I'm reading Karl Marx and my heart is fluttering. Oh, I'm swooning over the Communist Manifesto. And suddenly we bring these two things together and we've made an inference that I'm a communist. And now there's the knock on the door.
Yeah.
Right? Those are the stakes that we have, that we collect the data and we bring it together in ways that we didn't anticipate. So that would be one reason why we have to regulate not just the use, but the collection.
Okay, my favorite example of this very recently was GM was found to actually be sharing information on micro responses of drivers, right? So when did you slow down? How did your reaction time, all of that, and sharing that with insurance companies who were then creating graduated rates, and certain people that had that information were getting quoted higher rates than others based on the third-party access to literally them sitting in their car and what you were seeing.
You have to explain why is that bad? Because shouldn't we charge people more if they're worse drivers?
Who's we?
That's a great question. Let's go there.
So then we get into the questions of consent, right? So what does it mean to memeaningfully consent to use of your data? That was no consent in this concept, which is why it's so horrifying.
My poor driving?
I want to live in a walkable city, Ken. Let's escape this.
Full disclosure.
I question your premise.
Yeah, I don't own a car, don't have a driver's license. I'm an urban kid, so I'm with you. Yeah. But that's the point of of the subsidy. Yeah, exactly. But anyway.
No, but
no,
are
keep
those
going.
eye tracking data correct to begin with? Because there's a lot of information that shows it actually doesn't work on certain eye types. It doesn't work on certain skin tones. Are you distracted or not? Are you looking down? Is your bangs in your eye?
How is it being
What is the
contextualized,
methodology
right?
of that
How is it
data?
being
How
contextualized?
is distracted defined?
Yeah.
How is it weaponized? Are they giving me a better rate if I'm not distracted, or are they just
Nope.
using it to deny my claims? Anyone at Davos have a guess? I don't, this is any of that actually a process that we have any say in, or is it just going to be sort of processed through the objective function of the Optimus-seeking insurance corporation, which is probably not to give us better rates?
So these are good questions. I think you have gone from principled to practical, but from a practical level right now, the EU requires that all sexes are created equally, and therefore insurance rates for young adults who are drivers are set exactly at the same, even though young men are 3 or 4 times more likely to be in an accident than young women. So in effect, in Europe, young women subsidize the bad driving of young men.
I mean, so now we're getting into very philosophical conversations, which are, can you create categories where you're assigning risk to a broad category? And is that different in some way, morally, legally, and otherwise, categorically, frankly, to an individual, right, being abstracted from a category and not kind of amortizing risk across that group? And I mean, those are moral and philosophical questions. I think what is so viscerally repulsive about the example I gave is that there was a zero consent or awareness of any kind until an investigative journalist went out and discovered this and wrote a big expose on it, right? So we are all, I think we all find that repulsive, I mean, for obvious reasons. And I think there are fair questions around if that were the norm, and if you knew, could that be a method of incentivizing safer driving? Maybe, maybe not. Somebody would probably study it. There'd be big grants around it. There'd be a huge colloquium that came together about traffic safety. I mean, who knows? But the point is, this is happening all the time, right? And we think about it in social media because we're so aware of the harms, and we all kind of the thing. All of this we're talking about here at Future House all week, but we're not aware of it in other contexts, and we're only beginning to see the start of it when it comes to things like wearables. But question time, because we could go all day. Yes,
I
please.
just have one quick one because I'm a bit scared now of the things that I'm using as a just consumer.
That's probably healthy.
So tell me, what can I use with a good
Signal.
conscience? Yeah, okay, but what do you have a cloud server? Do you have?
No.
I mean, yeah.
No data.
Where am I going with my email, with my clouds, with my? I can do the chat thing, yes, but I don't want to chat. I like conversations. I need a mail server. I need a cloud. What do I do?
I mean, I can name a number of products that are better than the alternatives. I think Proton Mail is good, but it has to be proton to proton. That's kind of the rule of encryption. Proton also has a drive server. There are a couple of others that are, again, better. They're, Swiss-based. They're encrypted. I do want to push a little bit and just sort of, I think this is ultimately it's not an individual choice issue. A lot of this is sort of, the way that, we can walk down the street in Davos, and I'm sure there's like 11 million CCTV cameras hooked up to a Clearview facial recognition database that are sort of scanning us through X, Y, Z, right? Like we live in a world that is sort of inoculated with this technology. So there is a need for a broader society-wide pushback. But, in the meantime, there are these options that can be chosen to be more hygienic, and particularly when it comes to private communications, which are so easily weaponized, and in many cases, whether it's military, human rights, journalism, the difference between even life or death, or safety and danger, or keeping your job, or being able to whistleblower safely, etc. At Signal, that's our lane, and that's what we aim to provide in the midst of all of the rest of it.
I think I have a question back here, and I'll have time for one more question after that. Yeah, go ahead.
As a privacy nerd, just wanted to thank you for what is probably the most dense amount of information in such a brief chat, Daniela. So much that I testified in the New York Privacy Act myself, and one of the things that's kind of emerging as a means to protect the end user is this idea of self-sovereign identity, and there's a lot of emergent standards and competition around what those may be. So I just wanted to see if you guys had opinions on what a likely standard would be, and how that kind of tracks with fully homomorphic encryption and its development now.
I don't have the expertise to give a succinct answer on this. I think some of the developments are interesting, but again, I want to kick the tires on some of them, and I haven't done that thoroughly, so I'm going to abstain. Sheila?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, I mean, SSID is like the great promised unlock to everything, right? And I want to get back to ZKs, to the zero knowledge question, because a lot of them are predicated on zero knowledge, which I do think you're more than qualified to talk about some of the challenges in ZKs. But all that being said, they're going to be an improvement, no question. But I think we have to be very thoughtful and mindful about the reality that those standards are going to kind of become de facto, the defaults that we're using for how we're societally defining identity and privacy, which have exactly the same real world implications we've been talking about, right? So I don't mean to like hedge the question, because I think it's a very like literal question, and we can talk offline about it and some of the things that I've been working on, or I've been seeing in previous roles on this one. But I think it's important to remember you can't abstract an SSID away from the context in which it emerges, and you can't get away from some of the zero knowledge issues that do exist regardless, right? So, yeah. Fantastic, okay.
Yes, I just wanted to quickly raise a topic that is maybe a bit controversial, but I think the elephant in the room is that the intelligence agencies are not playing by the rules when it comes to surveillance. So the US have agreements with the UK, and in cases where they're not allowed to monitor US citizens, you have the UK doing it, and then they share the information because it's well established that all the intelligence agencies share intelligence about each other's citizens, actually, if they're of special interest. And I would really like to hear your views. I think we need a pushback on a global societal common scale to finish these practices.
Yeah. I mean, they're not playing by their own government's rules. They're often, the Snowden documents gave us more than enough evidence of the imbrication between the large surveillance industry and governments. Yep. I agree that it's not cool. And, this is why we build Signal with so much rigor, because we do know that intelligence agencies don't love that we protect, people. They do use us because we're actually provably secure. So that's what I got.
Well, you can't be subpoenaed for what you don't have, and you can't be forced, you can't be coerced into giving over what you don't have, right?
Yeah.
So, Ken, and then we'll take one last question.
A very brief one. It's true that there is this shell game going on, which the British ask the Americans ask the British. Okay, that's right. But the counterfactual, the alternative is worse, in which they just do it themselves, right? So the rules that we have were designed in a particular time to address a particular problem with a particular people of particular culture, right? Post-World War II and also post-Watergate, in which we put fetters on the power of the intelligence services, and they took that not quite blank check, but very open check, and they still comply with their own rules, but they interpret the language of the rules in such a way that they're not meeting the spirit of the law, even if they proclaim to meet the letter of it. And the Snowden disclosures showed two things, just what Meredith said. There was this complicit arrangement between the big tech and the company and the intelligence services, and they weren't following their rules. They were the spirit of it. But also there was, at the level of the harm, this is important, the level of the harm didn't exist. They were collecting this information. American spies were collecting this information. They really, really didn't want airplanes flying into buildings anymore. They really wanted to crack down on human trafficking and terrorism, right? If you look at, were they giving it to a political opponent? No, or someone to use against a political opponent? No. Were they knocking on the door of civil rights groups? They had in the past, the FBI had. They weren't. So that doesn't free them from their illegal activity, but it shows that they were operating in a certain culture of integrity for the purpose of security. Now, I don't think that's good enough. I think you should have integrity also in what you do and what you say you do. But the point is that we've lost that culture. And they have this immense, and it's relevant that we have a new administration now, they have this immense power, and they used to be governed not only by law is a terrible way of governing your activities, but by the culture and the spirit of what you believe. If now we've lost people who've lost that integrity of only using the information for the purpose of keeping their country safe and are now using it for other reasons, we are in big trouble. So I agree with you, it's a big problem, and we don't have an obvious answer.
So I don't think you're saying this. We'll take one more question. I don't think you're saying this, but I think the over-inclusion on no-fly is a really classic example of government overreach, right? And so as a community who was absolutely affected by that and who had a brother who couldn't walk down the street without that, I mean, all of this, right, with a beard without getting stuck. So these things are true, right?
Those are all implementational problems.
Are they, though? I mean, yes and no.
They are, well, they're ridiculous in the way they're implemented, but as a principle, knowing who's coming into your border before the plane lands, or actually before it takes off, probably isn't wrong if you feel like the threat level is such that you should know those things.
Look at like the Holy Land Foundation, right? Like this, it went well beyond sort of an implementation issue. Right. Like,
it's because
anyway,
it's a blunt instrument to solve a
yeah.
precise problem, right? Which it always
Yeah.
is. Okay, so one more question, and then I'm going to close this out.
Hi, thank you for this discussion. One of the things mentioned earlier is how a lot of companies are based on a marketing revenue model. How do you suggest them to pivot to maintain profitability, maintain the ability to provide these services without, using ad sales?
Yeah, well, and this is exactly what we work on at Project Liberty. You've come to the right place. And so I think we have to acknowledge that how are we defining profitability, okay? So the absolute exploitative, extractive, capitalistic models that are creating outlandish profitability for a small handful of actors. This is where governance is so important. Publicly traded companies would still have a capture model that benefits a very small group of people at the expense, I would say, of a lot of others. If you imagine that we're comfortable bringing down what profitability means to a maybe more reasonable level and being more distributive about how we think about how we allocate that profitability across a broader array of actors, including those who are at the creation, collection, and inference levels of all these different things, there are more fair, we call it the fair data economy, and there are models that actually can work, that are beyond the standard advertising versus subscription, kinds of things that we are familiar with. And I think it doesn't even honestly take that much creativity to imagine what those would look like, but the predicate premise has to be that decacorn is not the standard of success of any sort of private enterprise, right? And we are not in a world that we fight that as a predicate premise. If we don't, then we suddenly have a lot more surface area to have the conversation. Okay, I'm going to close this out because we could go all day. I hope that you two can stick around a bit more. We'll be mingling and here and there. But I want to close by saying there's a recognition, right? So I'll end where I started, which is how we define kosher, unkosher, illicit, licit activities is a fluid definition. And we are all making choices, whether intentionally or otherwise, every single day about the trade-offs we're willing to make between things like convenience and security, how we think about privacy, how we are setting the norms through our actions for what the societal default is. Right, in our communities, in a hyperlocal way, but also in a global level. So conversations like this are, I think, so important for so many reasons, but I hope that you're leaving with as much to ruminate on as I am. And thank you so much to Meredith and to Ken for joining me here today.
Sheila.